He looked me straight in the eye, in front of his wife, their friends, and a long table covered in champagne glasses and designer handbags, and said, "You're too poor to sit with us. Maybe if you were like the other women." And just like that, my son, the boy I raised with every ounce of love I had, sliced through me with a sentence sharper than any blade. I was sitting at the edge of that table, the very dinner I helped pay for, dressed in a simple navy dress I'd worn to church 2 years ago. My shoes had small scuffs on the sides. My purse, bought from the thrift store down the street, sat gently in my lap. I wasn't there to show off. I was there as his mother. The woman who once walked to 2 jobs just to afford his first school uniform. But in that moment, I didn't feel like his mother. I felt like an inconvenience. The laughter around the table softened into tension. One of the women, the kind who smells like perfume that costs more than my rent, glanced at me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Across from me, another adjusted her diamond necklace and leaned into Daniel's wife, whispering something that made them both chuckle. I couldn't hear what they said, but I didn't need to. I already knew. I didn't belong in their world. And worse, my son agreed. My hands tightened around the linen napkin in my lap. I kept my eyes on the table, pretending I hadn't heard what I'd just heard. Pretending I didn't feel the shame crawling up my throat. I told myself to stay calm, that it was just words. But inside my chest ached with something deeper than humiliation. It was the weight of everything I had ever done for that boy being erased with a single cruel comment. I thought about quietly standing, thanking the host, and leaving. I didn't want to cause a scene. I didn't want them to see me cry. I was almost out of my seat when my phone rang. I hesitated. It wasn't a number I recognized, but something told me to answer. So I did. "Mrs. Sarah," the voice said, "your company stock just hit 50 million. The forks froze. The table went silent. Glasses stopped mid-air. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Even Daniel stopped chewing and stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. And I sat back in my chair. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I just smiled. Not because of the money, not because of the silence, but because they had finally seen me. And in that moment, I knew. They had just lost the only woman who ever truly fed that table. But they didn't know what it cost me to get there. They didn't know who I was before the silence fell. Before I take you deeper, let me say this. Welcome to Granny Stories, where stories like mine are finally heard. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or humiliated by the people you raised, then you're in the right place. This isn't just a story. It's a reminder that silence isn't weakness. It's power, waiting for the right moment to speak. Now let me take you back to where it all started. My name is Sarah. I'm 68 years old, though life made me feel older long before my hair turned silver. I didn't grow up with wealth, and I never envied those who had it. I found my riches in love, in hard work, in the quiet strength of surviving one day at a time. I raised my son, Daniel, alone after his father died when he was just 6. One minute I was folding laundry and making peanut butter sandwiches. The next I was planning a funeral with a boy too young to understand what death meant. I didn't have the luxury to fall apart. I had to become everything overnight. Mother, father, provider, protector. I worked sunrise to sunset, and then some. I cleaned houses in the morning, stocked shelves at night, and walked home in shoes with paper stuffed in the toes. I wore hand-me-down coats and learned how to make chicken soup stretch 3 days. I didn't eat when he was hungry. I didn't rest when he needed something. I told him we were rich in love, and he believed me. And in a way, we were. When he got accepted into college, I cried in the bathroom at the grocery store where I worked, because I didn't know how I'd pay for it. But I found a way. I always did. I borrowed. I worked overtime, I sold my wedding ring, and when he graduated, I clapped the loudest. Even though he never looked back. Over time, the phone calls grew shorter, the visits less frequent. I became a background character in the life I once built for him. Still, I never stopped loving him. I never stopped being proud. But that night, the night he said I was too poor to sit at his table, I realized something. He hadn't just stopped seeing me as his mother. He had stopped seeing me as anything at all. They didn't know who I was. But I did. And that was the beginning of everything. Because once I stopped trying to be remembered by them, I started remembering the boy I once knew. the boy I raised. Daniel was always bright, charming in a way that made people lean in when he spoke. Even as a child, he had that spark, the kind that teachers noticed, that neighbors praised. He had a way of talking his way out of trouble, and when he smiled, it was like the whole room softened. He was my joy, my purpose, the reason I got up every morning when my back ached and my soul felt empty. When he was 12, he built a solar system out of scrap paper and bottle caps for his science fair. Took home first place. I remember the way he looked up at me with his blue ribbon, grinning like he'd conquered the world. He said, "We did it, Mom." And I believed him, because back then, we were a team. I saved every spare dollar for his future, skipped new clothes, took extra shifts, packed his lunches with hand-cut notes that said, "Be bold today." And when it came time for college, I did what I had to do. I borrowed money, emptied every savings account I had, and signed papers I barely understood. Because his dream was mine. When he got his first internship in the city, he called me from the sidewalk. "Ma, I made it," he said. I stayed on the phone with him the whole walk to his new apartment, just listening to his footsteps and the hope in his voice. I used part of my retirement to help him buy his first car. Nothing fancy, just enough to get him from job interviews to grocery runs without having to rely on strangers. And on his wedding day, I wore my best dress and the same shoes I wore to his high school graduation. They were old, but polished, clean. I sat in the front row, holding back tears not because I was losing him, but because I thought I was gaining a daughter. At the reception, I handed him an envelope. Inside was the down payment for their first home. He cried when he opened it, hugged me tighter than he had in years. And in that moment, I still believed his promises, that I'd always have a place in his life, that no matter how far he climbed, he'd never forget the hands that held the ladder. But something changed after that. Slowly at first, a missed birthday call, a canceled visit, fewer updates, more silence. The once soft voice that used to say, "Love you, Ma," started to sound rushed, distracted, distant. He never said it outright, but I felt it, the weight of his success making room for everything but me. He promised I'd always have a place in his life. But he forgot those words the moment money entered his. And on that birthday night, when he looked at me like I was nothing more than a shadow from his past, I finally understood. It wasn't that he no longer needed me, it was that he no longer saw me. It was that night, his 40th birthday, that the illusion finally shattered. The invitation had come late, just a week before the event, tucked between junk mail and an overdue electric bill. No call, no warm reminder, just a stiff little card with cursive print and directions to some upscale rooftop restaurant I'd never heard of. Still, I showed up. Of course I did. I wore my best dress. Navy blue, long-sleeved, with delicate lace at the collar. It had been with me through graduations, job interviews, even funerals, and still held its shape with quiet grace. I pressed it the night before and laid it out on the bed, right next to the small gift I'd made by hand. A memory book with photos, handwritten notes from his childhood, and a letter I wrote him the day he left for college but never had the courage to send. I arrived 5 minutes early. The valet looked confused when I stepped out of my modest sedan, holding my thrift store purse and a carefully wrapped gift with twine. He opened the door, but not without a pause, the kind of pause people give when they've already judged you. Upstairs, the restaurant glowed with crystal lights and soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. The air smelled of roasted duck and perfume I couldn't name. There was laughter, polished teeth, diamond earrings, and women dressed in satin gowns that shimmered when they moved. Faces tight with filler, hair high with effort. Everyone looked expensive. No one looked at me. I found Daniel near the bar, laughing with a man who seemed more like a banker than a friend. I waited for him to notice me. He didn't, so I stepped closer and gently tapped his shoulder. "Oh, Mom," he said, his smile flattening. "You made it." No hug, no warmth. Just a glance, a quick sweep from my shoes to my hair as if assessing damage. "Of course I made it," I said with a small smile. "I wouldn't miss your 40th. I handed him the gift. He looked at it, confused. "You didn't have to bring anything." That's when his wife walked over. She gave me a smile as cold as the white wine in her hand. Her eyes went straight to my purse. "That's vintage," she said with a tone that made it feel like an insult. I nodded politely. "It's been with me a long time." From the corner of my eye I saw two women whispering, glancing in my direction. One of them giggled and covered her mouth. I could hear bits of it. Who's she? That's his mother. No way. They laughed behind long lashes and fake nails. I tried to ignore it. I took a seat near the far end of the table, placing the gift gently beside my plate. The server passed me by once, twice. I had to ask for water. Around me the room sparkled. Gold cutlery, fresh orchids, tall glass centerpieces. It felt like walking into a catalog where everything had been chosen, including the people. And me? I was out of place. Like a misplaced memory in a room full of forgetfulness. Daniel barely spoke to me. No welcome speech. No introduction. No acknowledgement that I was the reason he was even standing there, in that custom suit, with that polished life. When he gave his birthday toast, I waited for my name. I listened closely, smiling as he thanked his colleagues, his wife, her parents, his mentors. I waited through every sentence, every sip. But he never said it, not once. Not even a passing mention of the woman who once held his hand through nightmares and sickness and heartbreak. Not even a word. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, and I felt something inside me finally fall still. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even sadness. It was silence. The kind that comes when you've been holding your breath for years, hoping one day they'd remember what you gave. But that day never came. And as the room applauded and he raised his glass, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit until that very moment. Daniel hadn't just left me behind. He had erased me. That realization settled in my chest like a stone dropped in water, quiet but heavy enough to ripple through every part of me. I looked around that table, at the people clapping for him like he had built his life with no one's help, like he was self-made and self-raised, like I wasn't even sitting right there in front of them. They cheered. His wife leaned in and kissed his cheek. A guest shouted, "To Daniel," and the glasses clinked all around. But not mine. I didn't lift mine. I didn't move. I told myself to just let it go, to keep my head down, and get through the rest of the night, with grace. But there was a voice in me, small and tired but still alive, that whispered, "Say something. Remind him who you are." So when the applause faded, and people returned to sipping their wine and sharing empty pleasantries, I stood up. The room didn't quiet for me. No one turned to look. It wasn't like when Daniel stood to speak. It was like I had disrupted something sacred. I cleared my throat, gently tapped the side of my glass with a spoon, and smiled. I just wanted to say a few words. But Daniel's voice cut through mine like a blade. "Mom," he said sharply, and the room actually did go quiet then. "Please. You're embarrassing." I froze, my mouth still half open, my fingers still brushing the rim of the glass. He didn't stop there. "Maybe if you were like the other women, I don't know, a little more polished, you wouldn't always make things so awkward." A few people chuckled under their breath. His wife looked away, smirking into her wine. One of her friends leaned over and whispered something into her ear, and they both laughed behind manicured fingers. I stood there, blinking slowly. My hand dropped to my side, my cheeks flushed, not from shame, but from the sheer disbelief of it. The boy I had loved more than I loved myself, now standing in front of all these strangers, acting like I was nothing more than a poorly dressed inconvenience. He turned back to his guests like nothing happened. The conversations picked back up. The waiter finally came by and poured me a glass of water like it was a pity offering. And then I heard it, soft but clear enough to pierce me. A woman down the table, her voice full of cruel amusement, said, "Maybe she should have just mailed a gift and stayed home." The man beside her snorted. "You'd think with a son like Daniel she'd look, well, better." And then, as if the final blow had been saved for dessert, Daniel leaned back in his chair, chuckled, and said, "She's too poor to sit with us anyway." That was it. That was the moment. The laughter around the table rose again, not loud, but sharp, cold, knowing. The kind of laughter people use when they're convinced you can't hurt them, because they don't believe you have anything left. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't even move, because something inside me had already moved. Quietly. Permanently. And just as I reached for my napkin to gather what little dignity I had left, that's when my phone rang. And with one call, the very table that mocked me would go silent. Just as I reached for my napkin, ready to disappear quietly into the background of my own son's celebration, my phone rang. At first, I almost didn't answer. I was in a room full of people who didn't care if I was there or not, who had just laughed at me, dismissed me, erased me. The polite thing, the expected thing, would have been to silence it, to let it ring and fade like I was expected to fade. But something in me stopped me. I looked down at the screen. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar. My heart did a small skip. I answered. "Mrs. Sarah," the voice said calmly, professionally, with a tone that didn't match the noise of the room around me. "I'm calling to congratulate you. Your shares just crossed $50 million. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't have to. Because right then, something strange happened. It was like the air shifted. The fork that had been halfway to someone's mouth didn't move. The champagne glass in one woman's hand slipped just enough to tap the table with a crisp, crystal sound. Daniel's wife, mid-laugh, suddenly froze. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. It was like someone had pressed pause on the entire room. I slowly stood up. Not for attention, just to walk out. But now, everyone was watching me. Daniel looked confused. "Mom?" he asked, the arrogance in his voice cracking, just slightly. I ended the call and slipped the phone into my purse. My hands weren't shaking anymore. "Everything all right?" someone asked. Too late to pretend they cared. I didn't answer. I just picked up the gift I had brought, the memory book no one bothered to open, and tucked it under my arm. As I moved toward the door, I passed the same women who had mocked my purse and whispered about my appearance. Their eyes followed me now, wide and blinking. One of them mouthed, "50 million?" to the other, as if she couldn't believe what she heard. And Daniel? He just sat there watching me like he'd never seen me before. Like I was a stranger in a story he didn't write. His mouth was slightly open as if he wanted to ask something, but he didn't. Because suddenly, for the first time in that whole night, he had no words. No defense, no laughter, only silence. And it was glorious. The same table that had mocked me, ignored me, reduced me to shame now sat frozen. Their wealth suddenly looked small, their jewels suddenly cheap, their voices useless. I didn't smile to be petty. I smiled because I had finally remembered my worth, and now, so had they. They thought they were above me, but they were just louder. And when the room finally went quiet, it wasn't because I had demanded it. It was because the truth didn't need to raise its voice. Because by the time they finally saw me, I had already built a life they couldn't even begin to imagine. You see, what they never knew, what Daniel never cared to ask, was what happened after he left. After the wedding, after the housewarming party, after the "thanks, Mom" and the silence that followed. While they were out building their glossy lives and polishing their social circles, I was rebuilding something of my own. From the ground up, brick by invisible brick. I didn't cry about being forgotten. I didn't beg for phone calls or guilt them into visits. No. I used that silence. I fed off it. I had always been good with numbers. Even back when I used to sort coins on the kitchen floor just to make rent. Budgeting became second nature to me, stretching every dollar like dough, flipping pennies like pancakes. After Daniel moved out, and the house felt too quiet, I started freelancing as a bookkeeper for small businesses in town. Laundromats, bakeries, local mechanics, nothing fancy, but honest work. And when my savings finally hit a modest cushion, I did something unexpected. I started learning. I signed up for free online courses, watched financial literacy videos late into the night, printed worksheets about investing, and studied them with a pencil and a highlighter, like my life depended on it. Because in some ways, it did. That's when I found a small tech company no one was talking about. Their stock was barely $1 a share. People called it foolish. But I read the financials. I listened to their founder speak on a podcast. I recognized something in their struggle, something that looked a lot like mine. Resilience. So I invested. Not all at once, just slowly, steadily, month after month. While others were posting pictures of vacations and toasting bottomless brunches, I was checking financial statements and watching the market like a hawk. I lived modestly, stayed out of debt, and held on to my investments like they were pieces of myself. And over time, it grew. The company started to rise. Their innovations got noticed. Their revenues soared. And before I knew it, that silly little investment turned into a portfolio. That portfolio turned into a fortune. And that fortune turned into freedom. No one asked how I was doing, not Daniel, not his wife, not the people who called me embarrassing. They didn't care to know, they just assumed I stayed small, and so I let them. Because sometimes, the best kind of power is the kind you don't show. The kind you build in silence while the world looks the other way. They never cared enough to ask how I was doing. So I never told them I was building an empire with my bare hands. And now, standing in the same room where I had just been laughed at, dismissed, and pushed to the edge of humiliation, I held something no one at that table had. Quiet power. The phone call had ended. The words 50 million still hung in the air like perfume, invisible, but impossible to ignore. I didn't need to repeat it. I didn't need to make a speech. The room, once full of laughter and clinking glasses, had turned into a gallery of stunned faces. Daniel was the first to speak, but even his voice had changed. It was no longer full of pride or sharpness. It trembled, just slightly, like a man trying to find his footing on a floor he thought he owned. "Wait, Mom, what stock? When did you start investing?" he asked, as if suddenly remembering I was more than just his past. His wife's smile returned, but this time it was laced with desperation. "You never mentioned you were into finance," she said, her tone light, falsely curious, as she reached out and touched my arm like we were suddenly close. The same women who whispered about my purse now leaned forward, asking what company it was, complimenting my business mind, saying they always knew I had an elegance to me. I said nothing, because in that moment their interest wasn't rooted in love, or apology, or recognition. It was hunger. They hadn't changed, just the math had. One man at the end of the table, the same one who laughed when Daniel mocked me, raised his glass, offered a fake smile, and said, "Well now, Sarah, you're the wealthiest woman in the room." I turned my head, looked him in the eye, and said with a calm, unwavering voice, "I always was." The silence returned, but this time it wasn't the silence of shame. It was the silence of realization. I picked up my purse slowly, still the same thrift store piece they had mocked, and held it with pride, because now they would never look at it the same way. Not because it had changed, but because I had reminded them who I was. Daniel stepped closer, almost as if to speak again, but I raised my hand gently. Not to silence him, but to excuse myself. No confrontation, no bareness, just boundaries made of grace. I nodded toward the server who had ignored me earlier. He gave me a small, startled bow this time, like he understood. I didn't owe them an explanation. I didn't owe them my story. Not anymore. I walked past the table where I had once sat invisible, and turned heads not because of what I wore, but because of what they finally saw. A woman they could no longer dismiss. I didn't explain, I didn't correct. I let the silence finish my sentence, and then I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. I simply walked out of that glass-towered restaurant with my chin high, my soul whole, and the memory book still tucked beneath my arm, the one never opened. That night, I slept with the kind of peace that comes when you've stopped asking for a seat at someone else's table. But the next morning, my phone rang again. This time, it was Daniel. His name lit up on the screen like a reminder of every version of him I had known. The toddler with scraped knees, the teenager with big dreams, the man who had just publicly humiliated me. I answered. "Mom?" His voice was different, lower, softer, like a boy again. Not the man from last night, but the son who used to call me before big tests just to hear me say, "You've got this." "Mom, he sighed. "I didn't mean what I said last night." I said nothing. He continued, trying to fill the silence. "You know I love you. I got caught up in the moment. There were people watching, and I was nervous, and you looked so out of place. There it was. Even an apology, he couldn't help but justify my humiliation. As if my existence in that room was the problem. As if my presence was something that needed explaining. I let him talk. I let him ramble through excuses, half-formed regrets, and apologies that tasted more like ego than remorse. And then, like I knew he would, he shifted. "There's actually something I wanted to ask you," he said. "I've been working on a business idea, a tech startup. We've been trying to raise capital, and, well, considering your financial situation now, I thought maybe you'd want to invest. We could even bring you in as an early partner. It could be really big, Mom." That was the moment it all came into focus. It wasn't the apology, it wasn't guilt, it was opportunity. He didn't call because he missed me. He called because my bank account had become more valuable to him than my presence ever was. I took a deep breath, and in the calmest voice I've ever used, I said, "You didn't invite me as a mother, Daniel. Don't reach for me as a millionaire." The line went quiet. Not dropped. Just still. I could feel the shock on the other end. The pause in his breath. The sound of someone realizing that the well they thought would always be there had finally dried up. He mumbled something. I didn't mean it like that, maybe. Or, I was just thinking it'd help us reconnect. I didn't catch all of it. Because I was done listening to words that came only after wealth. "I hope your project does well," I said simply. "But I'm not your investor." Then I hung up. Not out of anger. Out of peace. Because for the first time in my life, I stopped proving my worth to someone who only saw it when it came with a price tag. I stopped proving my worth to someone who only saw it when it came with a price tag. And when I ended that call, I didn't cry. I didn't feel hollow or angry. I felt light. Like I had finally laid down a burden I had carried for far too long. The burden of trying to be enough for someone who had already decided I wasn't. But life, as it always does, has a way of balancing the scales in quiet, unexpected ways. 3 days after that call, I found a small envelope in my mailbox. No return address. No business stamp. Just a shaky handwritten name in pink ink. Ava. My granddaughter, Daniel's daughter. She's only 8, but she's always been the one person at their house who truly saw me. While the adults talked over champagne, Ava would sit on the rug and ask about the books I read. She'd trace the wrinkles on my hand, like they were treasure maps, and say, "You smell like home." I opened the envelope and inside was a handmade card. Construction paper folded unevenly, decorated with crayon stars and glitter smudges. And in the center, written in careful letters with little hearts over every I, were the words, "Grandma, you're the richest person I know. Not just in money, in love." I sat down right there in the kitchen with that card in my hands and let my heart breathe for the first time in days. No one had told her to write that. No one coached her. That was just Ava. Pure, unfiltered truth from a child who understood more about love than the people twice her age. Inside the card, she had drawn 2 teacups and a note. "Can we have tea together? Just us girls every week?" I called her mother, Daniel's wife, and asked if it would be all right. She said yes. Almost too quickly, like she was trying to fix something without saying what it was. I didn't press. I had no interest in her intentions. What mattered was Ava. So that Sunday, I picked up a box of jasmine tea and 2 lemon scones from the little bakery down the street. I set out my floral tablecloth and brought down the old tea set, the one I'd saved for special occasions, though I could never quite define what special meant. Turns out, this was it. Ava showed up with a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm and a giant smile that stretched across her cheeks. "Grandma," she whispered as she walked through the door, "I saw how they treated you at Daddy's party. I didn't like it." I knelt down beside her and said, "It's okay, baby. Sometimes people forget how to be kind. But we remember, don't we?" She nodded, hugging me so tight, it felt like she was trying to hold my pieces together. From that day on, we had tea every Sunday. We didn't talk about stock markets or birthday dinners or who said what. We talked about flowers and books, and the dreams she had when she slept. We played card games and baked cookies that always came out a little lopsided. And I taught her how to steep tea just right. Not too long, not too short. Just like how trust should be built. In Ava's eyes, I wasn't poor. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't something to be pitied or mocked. I was her grandmother. And that was worth more than $50 million could ever buy. In Ava's eyes, I wasn't poor, I wasn't invisible, I was her grandmother. And that, in the end, was enough. But there's something else I never told anyone about that night, not even Ava. Before Daniel's birthday dinner, before the humiliation and the phone call and the silence that roared louder than applause, I had brought him a gift. Not the memory book I placed on the table. No, something else. Something bigger. Something I'd been preparing quietly for years. Inside my purse, tucked beneath the book, was a small white envelope, handwritten, sealed. And inside that envelope was a key, silver, simple, and worn around the edges. It was the key to a modest 3-bedroom home just outside of town, nestled near a park where he used to play as a child. I bought it in cash. 2 years ago. I didn't tell anyone. I just saw it one day while walking past a for sale sign, and something about it reminded me of beginnings, the kind you hope will grow into something lasting. I thought maybe he and his wife could use it as a second property, a retreat, a future inheritance for Ava. I didn't buy it for praise. I bought it out of love, love that still believed I had a place in his world. In the card I had written, "For all the times I couldn't give you the world, here's a little corner of it. With love, Mom." I had planned to give it to him after the dinner, quietly, without announcement. Maybe when the guests were gone. Maybe when it was just the two of us, the way it used to be. But I never gave it to him. Because after that dinner, I finally understood. Some gifts aren't meant to be handed to people who've forgotten how to hold them. So I drove to the house one last time, parked outside, walked through the rooms and touched the windowsills, the kitchen counters, the walls that had waited patiently to become a home. I sat on the floor of the empty living room, sunlight pouring in through the blinds, and I cried. Not from sadness, but from release. Then I called the director of a local women's shelter, the one I used to donate canned goods to back when I didn't have much more to give. I signed the deed over quietly, no press release, no public gesture, just paperwork and purpose. And before I left, I placed the card on the countertop, rewriting only the final line. It said, "This home was built with love. Let it go to someone who knows how to hold it." Sometimes, the most generous thing you can do is give the gift to someone who hasn't forgotten what it means to be held. That house may never carry Daniel's name, but now it carries something more valuable. Safety, warmth, and the kind of love that expects nothing in return. And that, to me, was the true inheritance. That house may never carry Daniel's name, but now it carries something more valuable. Safety, warmth, and the kind of love that expects nothing in return. And I carry peace. These days, I don't walk into glittering restaurants or sit at tables where laughter cuts like glass. I sit on my porch. Just me, a warm cup of tea, and the slow sway of the garden I planted with my own 2 hands. The same hands that once wiped Daniel's tears. The same hands that folded his laundry and carried the weight of 2 jobs, 2 decades, and too many silent sacrifices. There's no flash here. No noise. No one performing for status or pretending to be better than they are. Just birdsong in the morning and the scent of jasmine in the air. I sit in a rocking chair I bought secondhand 20 years ago. The cushion's still a little too firm, the frame creaky when the wind picks up, and I watch the world without needing anything from it. Because I've already done the hardest work. I let go. I don't replay that dinner in my mind anymore. I don't rehearse the insults or rewrite the silence. I don't wonder what would have happened if he had looked at me with pride instead of pity. Some questions don't need answers, just time. Time to realize that bitterness is a chain, and silence can be freedom. I sip my tea and smile at the hydrangeas blooming along the edge of the walkway. Ava planted them with me 2 Sundays ago. She calls them hope flowers, because they keep growing no matter what the weather throws at them. That's what I've become. They thought money gave them power. But it was love, sacrifice, and silence that built my throne. I don't need to be invited anymore. I don't need a place card at a table that never saw me. I've built my own table, and it's smaller, yes, quieter, absolutely. But every seat is filled with people who see me, not what I wear, who value my presence, not my portfolio. I'm not bitter. I'm simply done explaining. I'm not bitter. I'm simply done explaining. If you've ever been told you didn't belong, if they ever made you feel too plain, too small, too less than to be in the room, I want you to hear this clearly. Your value was never in their eyes. It was never in your clothes, your purse, or your paycheck. It was in the life you built when no one was clapping. In the meals you made while your stomach growled. In the quiet sacrifices you never named out loud. You see, I didn't lose a son that night. I simply saw who he'd become. And for the first time in my life, I chose me. I chose peace over proximity. I chose dignity over access. I chose to stop begging for a seat at a table I helped build, and instead I bought my own wood and carved a new one. One where love pulls out the chair. One where respect is never conditional. You don't need their validation to be real. You don't need their apology to heal. And you don't need their table to be full. If you've ever been silenced, betrayed, or undervalued, this space is yours. Subscribe to Granny's Stories, where we tell the stories that the world tried to bury. Where silence becomes strength. Where scars become sentences. And where women like us don't just survive, we outlast. Because we don't beg for seats at their table. We build better ones, and trust me, they'll hear the silence from here.